The first time I heard the voice, I was standing alone in the kitchen, washing dishes. The old farmhouse was silent, except for the steady trickle of water running over my hands and the soft hum of the refrigerator. The sun had set an hour ago, leaving the room bathed in the dim light of a single bulb above the sink. I was scrubbing a stubborn stain from a plate when I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible whisper just behind my ear. Emily. I startled, the plate slipping from my soapy hands and clattering into the sink. I turned around quickly, my heart loud in my chest, but the kitchen was empty. The small window above the sink revealing nothing but darkness outside. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, maybe a trick of my imagination. But the house felt different, heavier, like the air was thicker somehow. I finished the dishes quickly, my movements rushed and jerky, and then retreated to the safety of the living room. For the next few days, the voice stayed with me, always faint, always just on the edge of hearing. It whispered my name when I was brushing my teeth, when I was lying in bed at night, when I was alone in the barn tending to the chickens. At first, I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation of the sticks. But as the days passed, the voice grew louder, more insistent. Emily, come here. One evening, I was sitting on the porch trying to read a book when the voice came again, clearer this time, almost like someone was standing right behind me. Emily, come here. I snapped my head up, the book slipping from my fingers. My eyes darted around the yard searching for the source. The trees were still, the fields were empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching me. Come here, Emily. The voice was stronger, now sounding like it was coming from inside the house. My heart raced as I stood up slowly and turned towards the front door. It was open, just a crack, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. The voice beckoned me again, pulling me towards the house like an invisible thread. I stepped inside, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The house was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp in the hallway. The voice was louder now, echoing off the walls as if it was surrounding me. Come here, Emily. It led me down the hall towards the stairs. My feet moved on their own, carrying me up the creaking steps, my hand trailing along the cold, wooden banister. The voice guided me up to the door at the end of the hallway, the one that led to the attic. I stopped in front of it, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I didn't want to go up there. The attic was a place I had avoided ever since I moved into the farmhouse, a place that always felt wrong, like it didn't belong to the rest of the house. But the voice insisted, louder now. Emily, come here. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The wooden stairs leading up to the attic were steep and narrow, disappearing into the darkness above. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs, wanting instead to turn and run. Come here, Emily. The voice echoed from the darkness. I took a deep breath and started up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was trying to hold me back. The attic was pitch black, the only light coming from the small window on the far wall. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the shapes of old furniture covered in white sheets and boxes stacked high against the walls. But there was something else up there, something moving in the shadows. Emily. Emily. The voice was right behind me now. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there, but the darkness seemed to pulse, to close in around me. I backed up against the wall, my hands pressed against the cold, rough wood. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, the shadows extending along the walls. It wasn't one voice, but a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from within the walls of the attic. I felt something brush against my arm, something cold and damp, but when I looked, there was nothing, only shadows. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness was overwhelming me, consuming me. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the attic as the first morning light streamed in through the window. The shadows were gone, the air was clear, and the house was silent. But as I tried to move, I felt something strange, something unsettling. My hands were pressed against the wooden floor, but they felt different. I looked down and saw that my skin was pale gray, almost translucent, the veins beneath it dark and pulsing. My fingers gripped the wood, and I realized with a shock that I could feel the house, feel it breathing, feel it alive beneath me. Panic surged through me, and I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like they were anchored to the floor, rooted to the spot. I could feel the house in my bones, in my very being, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I was part of it now, and I wasn't alone. There were others here. Despite the silence, I could feel them now, like I could feel my own skin. I was no longer just Emily. I was something more, something entwined with the house, bound to it in a way I couldn't escape. I wanted to scream, to run, to break free, but all I could do was lie there, feeling the others and the house around me, in my veins, knowing I could never leave. I had been living alone for nearly 6 months when the first incident occurred. My little apartment in the suburbs was perfect for someone like me who worked from home. Quiet, tucked away, with neighbors that kept to themselves. It wasn't much, but it was comfortable. It started on a Tuesday evening. I had just settled onto the couch with a cup of tea and a book when I heard it. A faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. I paused, listening, my eyes scanning the room, when the sound came again, this time louder and more insistent. It was coming from the window behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see something there, a branch maybe scraping against the glass. But the window was clear, and outside the night was calm, the trees in the yard still as stone. I shook it off, telling myself it was nothing, just the wind or maybe an insect. But when the persistent tapping resumed, it felt like someone, or something, was deliberately trying to get my attention. I stood up, my body tense, and moved toward the window. As I got closer, the tapping stopped abruptly, leaving the room with a heavy, unnatural silence. I reached the window and peered outside, but there was nothing, just the dark outline of the trees against the night sky. I checked the lock on the window and pulled the curtains shut, trying to ignore the anxiety settling in the pit of my stomach. But that night, as I lay in bed, I wondered if someone had been at that window, watching me. The next few days were uneventful, but I couldn't get the tapping out of my mind. At night, I found myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone there, or to hear that sound again. But it never came, at least not at first. A week later, it started again. This time, it was more than just tapping. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards behind me. I froze, My hand still in the soapy water, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Someone was in the apartment with me. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, but the kitchen was empty. I grabbed my biggest knife and held it in front of me, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. The apartment was small, and it wouldn't take long to check every corner, turning on the lights to illuminate every shadow. But as I moved from room to room, my anxiety grew. Each room was empty, just like always, but the feeling that I wasn't alone was inescapable. As I moved, the creaking sound followed me, always just behind, as if something was playing a cruel game of cat and mouse. By the time I made it back to the living room, I was trembling, my grip on the knife so tight my knuckles hurt. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small lamp in the corner. I stood there, staring at the shadows, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing in the doorway to the bedroom. It was inhumanly tall and thin, its outline blurry in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, facing me. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, like it was closing in around me. I tried to speak, to demand who or what was there, but the words just caught in my throat. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and I stumbled back, hitting the wall, unable to move away. I felt a cold dread wash over me as the figure continued to advance. But just as it reached the edge of the light, it vanished, disappearing as if it had never been there. The room was empty, silent, the only sound my ragged breathing as I stood in my empty apartment, gripping the long knife in my sweaty hands. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the living room, watching the shadows, waiting for something to happen, but it didn't. By morning, I was exhausted, questioning everything. I tried to rationalize at first that I'd been tired, stressed, that it had been my imagination, but I knew that wasn't true. Something had been there, inside my apartment. The next few nights were a blur of sleeplessness and paranoia. Every creak, every sound from outside, every shadow sent my heart racing. I couldn't see the figure, but I could feel its presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting. Then one night, as I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the tapping. This time it wasn't at the window. It was just above my headboard, echoing through the wall above my head and up into the ceiling. As it grew from a tap to a loud thundering boom shaking the walls, I covered my ears and prayed for it to stop. The banging formed into a thunderous "Get out!" sending a jolt of fear through me inside that dark room with the shadows rising over the shaking walls. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my wallet, keys, and phone and bolted out of the apartment, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, with the cool night air hitting my face, my breath coming in gasps. I never went back to that apartment. I left everything behind, furniture, clothes, everything. I couldn't risk going back, couldn't risk facing whatever was in that place. I found a new apartment to live in, far away from that cursed place. I don't know what it was, a ghost, a demon, something else entirely, I don't know, but I do know it was real. And I know that whatever it was wanted me gone. I sometimes still hear the tapping in the quiet moments before sleep, or in the stillness of the early morning. I don't know if it's a memory, a lingering echo, or something trying to follow me. But when I wake, it's gone. and that is all that matters. It was a slow night at the diner, the kind where the minutes drag by and every sound echoes in the empty space. I had been working weekend shifts at Rosie's for nearly 3 years. The job was usually mundane, and there was a comfort in the routine, the clinking of silverware, the hum of the neon sign outside, the regulars that came in after their shifts for a late dinner or an early breakfast. But tonight felt different. The usual warmth of the diner seemed to have bled out, leaving the place cold and hollow. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting odd shadows that danced along the walls. I figured I was just tired, having pulled a few doubles that week. It was close to midnight when the bell above the door jingled, and I looked up from the counter, expecting to see one of the regulars, maybe old Mr. Davis, who always came in for his late-night coffee and pie. But it wasn't Mr. Davis. The man who entered was tall, almost too tall, with a gaunt face that seemed to stretch unnaturally long under the dim lights. His skin was pale, sickly gray, and his eyes were the worst part. They were deep set and dark, as if the pupils had swallowed the irises whole. When he smiled, it was a slow, deliberate stretch of thin lips that didn't reach those empty eyes. "Just coffee," he said with a low, raspy voice, like the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. He slid into a booth near the back, his movements slow and deliberate, as if every step was carefully measured. "Sure thing," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I grabbed a pot of coffee from the warmer. As I walked over to his booth, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes were on me the entire time, following my movements like a predator stalking its prey. I poured his coffee, the steam rising between us, but he didn't touch the cup. He just stared at me, that unnerving smile still plastered on his face. "Quiet night," he remarked, his tone casual, though there was an undercurrent of something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Yeah, it is," I forced a smile. "Anything else I can get you?" He shook his head slowly, his smile widening just a fraction. "No, thank you. Just the coffee." I nodded and hurried back to the counter, eager to put some distance between us. But even from behind the counter, I could feel his eyes on me, unblinking and intense. I busied myself with cleaning, anything to avoid looking in his direction, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. Minutes ticked by, which felt like hours, and the man didn't move, didn't drink his coffee, didn't do anything but sit there, watching me. The only sound in the diner was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. And then, as I wiped down the counter and checked the clock for the 100th time, I heard it. A whisper, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. "Come closer." I froze, my hand gripping the rag so tightly my knuckles turned white. I looked around, but the diner was empty, save for the man in the booth, and he hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but I could have sworn the whisper had come from his direction. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. I was tired, that was all. Just tired and jumpy from the long shift. But when I heard it again, it was louder. "Come closer." It was unmistakable now, a voice that seemed to curl around the edges of my mind, tugging at something deep inside me. It wasn't the man's voice. This was different, higher pitched, almost like an echo, and it filled the air around me. I looked back at the kitchen, but the cook was out back smoking. I glanced at the man in the booth. He was still staring at me, that smile never wavering. But now there was something else in his expression, something expectant. "Come closer," His lips hadn't moved, but I knew I had to comply. Against my better judgment, I took a step forward towards the man, then another, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. As I approached his booth, the air around me seemed to thicken, and I couldn't look away from him. My head buzzed with a strange, disorienting pressure, and the closer I got, the more the room warped around me, the walls bending and twisting like the diner itself was breathing. Finally, I was standing in front of him, the coffee cup still untouched on the table. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed me in place. The man looked up at me, his dark eyes gleaming with something ancient and hungry. When he spoke, his voice was different, no longer the low rasp from before, but a soft, melodic tone that was disturbingly familiar. "Do you want to see?" I didn't know what he meant, but the words filled me with a deep, primal fear. My mouth was dry, and I tried to take a step back, shaking my head. "No, Before I could finish, the man's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with an iron grip. His touch was ice cold, and I felt a jolt of pain shoot up my arm, as if his skin was white hot. "See," he whispered cruelly, and the world around me exploded into darkness. We were no longer in the diner. I was standing in a vast, empty void surrounded by shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. In the distance, I could see someone standing alone in the darkness. As I moved closer, clearing the shadows, I could see the figure more clearly. It was a woman. Her back was to me, and her long hair hung in matted clumps down her back. She was humming softly, a lullaby that sent shivers down my spine. "See," the man's voice echoed around me, and the woman turned slowly, her face still hidden in the shadows. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped, forced to watch as the woman approached me, her movements slow and deliberate. And then, as she stepped into the light, I saw her face. My face, twisted and deformed with eyes that glowed red. The woman, my doppelganger, smiled wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and the world of shadows began to crumble around me. The ground beneath me gave way, and I fell, spiraling into an abyss of darkness. When I awoke, I was back at the diner, lying on the floor in front of the booth, and the man was gone. The coffee cup in his booth was still full, the liquid cold and untouched, proof that he had been there. I sat up, my head spinning, my body drenched in sweat. The diner was empty and silent. I never saw the man again, but when I'm alone, standing in front of the mirror, his voice tugs at my mind again, whispering, "See," and the face that stares back at me isn't entirely my own. The heavy wooden doors of St. Augustine's Cathedral creaked as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the vast, dimly lit nave. The air inside was cool, almost unnaturally so, and carried the faint scent of incense mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was late, almost 10, and the church was empty, save for the flickering candles lining the altar. I had come for confession. Father Michael had agreed to meet me after hours, a special request given the circumstances. My hands trembled slightly as I walked down the center aisle, the stone floor hard beneath my feet. I could feel the weight of the cathedral pressing down on me, the shadows of the high vaulted ceiling seeming to stretch and twist in the low light. The confessional booth stood at the far end of the nave, a dark wooden structure that seemed older than the church itself. As I approached, I noticed that the door to the priest's side was slightly open, and I saw nothing but darkness within. "Father Michael?" There was no answer. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door to my side of the booth. The silence was oppressive, the kind that seemed to swallow up all sound, leaving only the faint thrum of my heartbeat in my ears. I wondered if I should leave. But I opened the door and stepped inside anyway, the wood creaking beneath my weight. The confessional was cramped, the walls close in around me. I sat down on the hard wooden chair facing the small screen that separated my side from the priest's. The thin mesh was dark, making it impossible to see the other side. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," I began into the stifling silence. But there was still no response from the other side. "Father?" I tried again, my voice shaking slightly. After what felt like an eternity, a low, rasping voice answered, "Go on, my child." There was something off about the voice. It was deeper than I remembered, rougher, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. I hesitated again, my fingers clutching the arm of the chair. I've been having strange thoughts. Dark thoughts. I see things that aren't there. I'm hearing whispers at night. It's like something's following me, something's watching me. The voice on the other side let out a low sound. Was it a laugh? "Continue," it urged, the word drawn out, dripping with malice. I swallowed hard, my sense of anxiety, the sense of unease growing stronger. The confessional felt even smaller now, the walls pressing in closer. I've felt its presence for weeks. It's always there, just out of sight. I hear footsteps behind me. I see shadows that move when they're not supposed to. And the dreams, God, the dreams are the worst. I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in my own sweat, with the feeling that something's in my room, watching me. As I spoke, I realized I couldn't hear Father Michael's breathing, the usual soft rustle of his robes as he shifted in his seat. The silence on the other side of the screen was absolute. "Father?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Is that all?" the voice replied, but this time it sounded closer, as if it was right next to me, separated only by the thin mesh of the screen. I froze. There was something terribly wrong. The voice was no longer human. There was a distortion to it, a guttural, inhuman tone. Suddenly the confessional plunged into darkness. The dim light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls flickered out, leaving me in pitch blackness. I reached out, fumbling for the door, but the small space seemed to twist around me, the walls closing in, trapping me there. I could hear it now, breathing low and heavy, coming from the other side of the screen. But it wasn't Father Michael. "Is that all, my child?" the voice repeated, closer now, as if it was right beside me. I stumbled, my fingers finally finding the door handle, but it wouldn't budge, as if something was holding it shut. The confessional screen tore in the darkness, and the breathing grew louder, more ragged, until it was right behind my ear. I felt cold breath on my neck, sending a wave of terror through me. My pulse thundered in my ears, and my entire body trembled with fear as I sank into the corner of the confessional. Then, beside me in the darkness, I heard it. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakably close. "You're not confessing," it hissed, the voice low and guttural, dripping with evil. "You're inviting." Inviting? The word sent a chill through me, and suddenly I understood. Whatever it was, this thing, this presence, I had called it here. I had let it in. Terror surged through me, and I pushed at the door with all my strength. It flew open, and I tumbled out of the confessional onto the cold stone floor of the cathedral. But I wasn't alone. I felt like I was being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the confessional. The wooden door to the priest's side was still ajar, but now the inky darkness was leaking out onto the white floor. As I stared at it, the door creaked open further, and I saw absolute darkness slithering and writhing within, slowly escaping into the church. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My footsteps echoed through the empty cathedral. As I bolted down the aisle, the oppressive air clinging to me like a shroud, the shadows seemed to reach for me, grasping at my coat to pull me back into the confessional. The heavy wooden doors of the cathedral loomed ahead, my only chance of escape. I threw myself against them, bursting out into the cold night air. As I ran through the parking lot, the shadow dissipating behind me. For now. But I knew it would follow me wherever I went. Even now, as I write this, I can feel it, watching just out of sight, waiting to be called again. The rain was coming down in sheets as I hurried across the darkened campus, my footsteps splashing through puddles on the worn cobblestone path. It was late, close to midnight, and the campus was nearly deserted. The old Gothic buildings loomed around me, their shadowy facades barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps. The storm had knocked out the power in several parts of the college campus, leaving large sections in total darkness. I was on my way back to my dorm after a late workout session at the gym. I had stayed longer than I intended, losing track of time. But now the silence around me felt oppressive, as heavy as the driving rain that had driven everyone inside. As I passed the old science building, I noticed something strange. The lights were still on in the upper floors, turning on and off in a regular pattern, like someone was testing the lights. I remembered hearing that the building had been closed for renovations, but it was supposed to be empty, especially at this time of night. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood staring up at the windows through the rain. For a split second, I saw something in one of the windows. A person standing perfectly still, staring down at me. I stopped in my tracks, blinking the rain out of my eyes, but when I looked back again, they were gone. I stood there for a moment. Had I imagined it? The rain had a way of distorting things, and I continued on, walking faster. The path took me closer to the science building, and as I passed, I couldn't help but look up at the windows again. The lights were still turning on and off, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was overtired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I walked away, I felt someone's eyes on me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Looking over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone following me, but there wasn't anyone there, just the empty path, shrouded in rain and darkness. I was almost to my dorm when I heard it, a sound that carried on the wind. I strained to listen over the rain. I heard it again, louder this time, like a howling wind coming from behind me from the direction of the science building. Slowly, I turned around, but again the path behind me was empty, the old science building standing silent and dark in the distance. But the sound continued, growing louder and becoming more insistent. I felt like something was about to happen. I took a step back. My first instinct was to run, to get back to my dorm as quickly as possible, but something kept me there with a morbid curiosity I couldn't ignore. I turned back toward the science building, drawn by the flashing lights on the top floor. As I approached the building, the sound grew louder, clearer over the rain. It wasn't a sound, but a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was pleading, desperate. I reached the front entrance, and the heavy wooden door was open, the rain pooling inside the lobby. My hand hovered over the door, and I could feel a cold draft of the air conditioning seeping out of the building from the darkness inside. With a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the wall beyond the stairway. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. The whispering surrounded me now, echoing off the walls, filling my ears. I could hear the desperation in the voices. I could feel their fear. I took a step forward, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. Then the building went silent, except for the driving rain outside. It was so cold my breath was fogging in front of me, and I could see my reflection in the dark, polished floor. But something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving. It was still as I took a step forward. I took another step and my reflection moved, but not in sync with me. It was delayed, like it was struggling to keep up. I could taste the bile from my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Suddenly, the flickering lights went out, plunging the lobby into total darkness. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest. And then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like something was moving in the darkness ahead of me. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained to see through the blackness. The shuffling grew louder, closer, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet were trapped in one spot. I could feel the presence now, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. It moved past a window and was illuminated for a split second. It was tall and thin, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its eyes glowing silver in the darkness. Then it was right in front of me, but I felt no warmth from it, as close as it was. I screamed and turned to run, but I hit something solid. My hands felt cold, clammy skin, and I realized with horror that it was my own reflection now standing in front of me, blocking my path. Its eyes were wide with terror, its mouth twisted into a silent scream. I tried to push past it, but it held me in place, its grip like iron. The shuffling grew closer, closer, louder, until it was right behind me. I could feel its presence breathing down my neck. I could smell the stench of decay and rot. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on upstairs, steady now, lighting the lobby enough to see I was alone. There was no reflection, no mirror. The doors to the building were wide open, and I could see the rain pouring down outside. All I could think about was getting as far away from that place as possible. I didn't want to understand it or reason through it. I just wanted to forget it had ever happened. The apartment was unusually quiet as I settled into bed, the faint hum of the heater the only sound breaking the silence. I lived in a shared apartment with 2 roommates, but they were out for the night. It was just past midnight, and I was exhausted after a long day of work and classes. The soft glow of my bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, making the corners seem darker than usual to my tired eyes. I turned off the lamp and snuggled under the covers, feeling warm and comfortable in my bed. The room was dark now, with only the occasional flash of street light creeping through the blinds. I was just beginning to drift off to sleep when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. It was persistent, like a heartbeat. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just one of our neighbors, but as the minutes ticked by, the thumping grew louder, and I couldn't ignore it in the stillness of the night. It seemed to be coming from the direction of my closet. I'd left the door slightly open, and as I lay there in the darkness, staring into the black closet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving inside. I didn't want to, but I had to check. I reached over to my nightstand and turned on the lamp. The room was bathed in a warm yellow light, and the thumping suddenly stopped, leaving a heavy silence in the room. I stared at the closet door, hesitating for a moment, then gathered the courage to get out of bed. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I approached the closet. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, my mind racing with every possible explanation. Something had fallen from a shelf, I hoped. I slowly pushed the door open, the hinges groaning softly. Inside the closet, there was nothing out of the ordinary, just clothes hanging, my shoes lined up along the floor, and a couple of boxes in the corner. I let out a shaky breath, feeling silly. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling coming from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. The closet looked the same, but the rustling continued, now louder. It was coming from above, from inside the ceiling. There was something in the attic. The sound was now unmistakable, a shuffling, scraping noise like someone or something was moving around up there. The attic was accessible only through a hatch in the hallway, and I knew my roommates hadn't been up there in weeks. I considered calling the police, but the thought of them arriving to a quiet, empty apartment and finding nothing scared me more than the noise itself. I felt a sickening sense of dread as I weighed my options. I knew I had to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The rustling sound was getting louder, more frantic as I reached up and pulled the hatch open. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the wooden stairs leading up to the attic. The air smelled musty and stale, and I could see cobwebs hanging from the rafters. As I began to climb the stairs, the rustling grew more intense, as if whatever was up there was becoming agitated. My flashlight beam shook in my trembling hands as I climbed the steep stairs. When I finally reached the top, I found myself in a small, cluttered attic filled with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. The rustling had stopped, replaced by silence. I scanned the room with my flashlight, but there was nothing out of place. I took a cautious step higher into the attic, and that's when I saw it. A dark, shadowy figure crouched in the corner, hidden in the shadows. It was hunched over, its limbs bent like it was ready to pounce. It was still, but I could feel its darkness stretching towards me, suffocating me. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. In that moment, I heard a voice in my ear, disembodied, a hiss in the darkness. "We are Legion." I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, and I knew I had to get out of there. I scrambled down the stairs, tripping over the steps, and as I fell backwards, the attic door slammed shut behind me, and I scrambled back to my room, slamming the door and locking it. I sat on my bed, trying to calm my racing heart. The house was silent, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something was hovering just beyond the edges of my perception. The rest of the night I spent in a panic, unable to sleep. I didn't dare leave my room, terrified that whatever was in the attic was still out there, waiting. The next morning, I told my roommates what had happened, and we checked the attic together. But again, nothing was out of place, and there were no strange noises. I moved out of that apartment as soon as I could. Working from home had always been my dream. No commute, flexible hours, and in the comfort of my own space. I'd been doing it for years, answering phones for a tech support line. The routine was simple. Sit at my desk, log in, and wait for the calls to roll in. Most of the time, it was mundane, troubleshooting the same issues over and over, but tonight was different. The moment I logged in, something felt off. It started subtly. I first noticed it about an hour into my shift. The call was muffled, and I had to disconnect, asking them to call back. I told myself the issue was on their end, maybe a server issue. When the next call came through, a crackle in my headset actually hurt my ears. "Hello, this is tech support. How can I assist you?" I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. There was silence on the other end, just a low hiss of static, then a faint, almost imperceptible whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent and desperate. I leaned closer to my monitor, adjusting the volume. "Hello? Can you hear me?" I asked again, straining to listen. The whispering stopped, replaced by a soft click, as if someone had gently ended the call. I stared at the screen, confused. Maybe it was a wrong number. But something about it felt wrong, like I'd just overheard something I wasn't supposed to. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the next call. It was a standard issue, someone having trouble with their Wi-Fi connection. I walked them through the steps, my voice steady, but my mind kept going back to that last caller. Then it happened again. "Hello, tech support, how can I assist you?" I said, bracing myself. More static, this time louder, crackling in my ears. The whispering was clearer now. I could almost make out the words, a soft chanting that repeated. I strained to listen, catching fragments. "Not alone. They're watching." "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking slightly. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was piquing my headset. I yanked it off. I stared at the headset, dread coiling in my stomach. It was just a prank, I told myself, some sick joke. But it didn't feel like a joke. It felt real. I debated logging off for the night, but the rational part of my mind told me I was overreacting. I needed to finish my shift, get through the night, and everything would be fine. The next call came through almost immediately. "Hello, tech support," I said, my voice trembling. This time, there was no static and no whispering, just breathing. Slow, deliberate, like someone was on the other end listening to me. I could hear the faint creak of floorboards, as if the person was moving around. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper now. The breathing continued, growing louder, more labored. I could almost picture the person on the other end, hunched over the phone, their breath hot and ragged. "Who is this?" My breathing stopped, replaced by the silence. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, the person spoke. "I can see you." My blood ran cold. I felt my heart skip a beat as the words sank in. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting to the windows, the slider leading to the back patio. But the room was empty. Yet I could feel eyes on me. "I'm calling the police," I said. The line went dead. I ripped off the headset, my hands trembling. I fumbled for my phone, my personal phone, but when I looked at the screen, my heart dropped. There was a text notification, received just moments ago, from a blocked number. "Don't look behind you." I felt the heat rise in my face. My hands were sweaty as I tapped the second notification. It was a single line, no signature, no context. "I'm coming." I froze, feeling someone or something right behind me. Slowly, I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was empty, just as it had been before, but the air felt different, charged with tension. I bolted from the room, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside. I looked up at the windows of my apartment, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, just the illuminated window of my second-floor apartment, clearly visible from the sidewalk where I was now standing. I reported the incident to my manager, who recommended I take a few days off. I still work from home for the same company, and even now I worry that whoever or whatever had found me that night will call again. The dense Maine woods were darker than I'd anticipated, the towering pines closing in as I followed the trail. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the forest drenched in shadows. My breath came out in cold puffs, the chill of early October sinking deep into my bones. This was supposed to be the hunt of a lifetime. A moose tag was hard to come by, and I'd finally gotten one. My guide, Tom, was a local, someone who'd been tracking moose for decades. He knew these woods better than anyone, or so he claimed. But now, alone in the darkness, I was beginning to doubt him. Tom had gone ahead to check the game trail. He told me to stay in the small clearing and that he wouldn't be long. But that had been over an hour ago. I tried not to let panic set in, but the longer I waited, the more uneasy I became. The woods were unnaturally quiet. There were no distant calls of owls or rustling of small animals, just an oppressive silence that felt like it was pressing in on me. I shifted on my feet, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, constantly turning and looking into the darkness of the woods. I glanced at my watch. It had been over an hour and still no Tom. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my rifle, slung it over my shoulder, and started down the trail he'd taken. The underbrush was thick, snagging at my boots as I moved deeper into the woods. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness, the shadows twisting and dancing as I walked. I called out to Tom, my voice sounding small and weak in the vastness of the forest, but there was no response. I walked on, the silence growing heavier with every step. My mind raced with possibilities. Had he gotten lost? Injured? Or worse? I tried to keep my thoughts in check, but the unease was building, the knot tightening in my gut. Then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My flashlight flickered, casting brief, fleeting shadows that seemed to move just beyond my sight. I swung the beam around, but there was nothing there. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep moving. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The woods were playing tricks on me. But then the growl came again, louder this time, and closer. It sounded so wrong, not like any animal I'd ever heard before. Tom? But there was no answer. I picked up my pace, the underbrush crunching loudly underfoot. The growling followed, seeming to come from all around me, echoing off the trees louder and quieter. I was no longer walking, I was running, the flashlight bouncing in my hand, casting frantic beams of light. Then I saw it, a figure in the distance, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. It was crouched low, almost hidden in the shadows. My heart leapt, thinking it was Tom, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't him. The figure was too big, too distorted. It looked like a moose, but twisted, unnatural. Its antlers were massive, but they weren't like any moose antlers I'd ever seen. They branched out in impossible directions, like a tree growing wild. Its body was gaunt, the skin hanging loosely over its bones, and its eyes, God, those eyes were sickly, glowing yellow. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The creature's head snapped up, locking its gaze on me. The growling grew louder, resonating through the trees, vibrating in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs couldn't move. I was stuck, paralyzed with fear. The creature began to move, its limbs bending and cracking as it crawled toward me, its body contorting in unnatural ways. It was almost upon me, its growling turning into a low, menacing laugh. I finally found the strength to turn and run, the flashlight slipping from my grasp as I bolted through the trees. Branches whipped at my face, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but I didn't dare stop. The laughter followed me, growing louder, echoing through the woods. I could hear the creature's footsteps behind me, fast and heavy, gaining on me with every step. I was running blind now, no flashlight to guide me, just sheer terror propelling me forward. I burst into a clearing, nearly tripping over a fallen log. I could see the faint glow of a flashlight on the ground in the distance. Tom's flashlight. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning and my legs aching. But as I reached the light, I skidded to a stop. Tom was there, lying on the ground by the flashlight, but he wasn't moving. His body was twisted and broken, his eyes wide open and staring blankly towards the sky. I heard the growling behind me, louder now, so close I could feel the hot breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature was there, towering over me, its twisted antlers casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and spoke in a voice that was both a growl and a whisper. "Welcome to the hunt." The last thing I saw before everything went dark was those sickly yellow eyes glowing in the night and the twisted, monstrous smile spreading across that creature's face. I had been teaching for almost 10 years, but this was my first year at Oak Ridge Elementary. The school year was about to begin at this sprawling red brick school, and I was there late to finish setting up my classroom. The school had a reputation for being haunted, but it was the kind of rumor kids spread to scare new teachers, nothing more. I never believed any of it until this happened. It was late, almost 8 o'clock, and the hallway was empty. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the polished floors as I made my way to room 117, my classroom. The custodians were long gone, and the only light came from the dull, flickering bulbs overhead. As I entered the classroom, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it before leaving for my break. Pushing it open, I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The air felt colder than it should have been, and a chill crept into my bones. I flipped the light switch, but the lights didn't come on. The only light was the yellow glow from the hallway, which seeped into the room, casting long shadows across the empty desks. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to make my way towards the front of the room. As I approached my desk, I heard it. A faint whisper. I froze, my pulse quickening. The whisper was so soft, I couldn't make out any words, but it was definitely human. I slowly turned, scanning the room with the phone flashlight. The rows of desks were empty and silent, with the chairs pushed neatly into place. "Hello?" My voice cracked as I called out, the word echoing unnaturally in the silent room, but there was no response. Just the whispering, which now sounded like it was growing louder. The sound seemed to be coming from the back of the room. I took a deep breath and moved towards it, each step slower than the last. The whispering grew clearer as I neared the back corner, until finally I could hear distinct words. "Help me, please." The voice was that of a kid, desperate and pleading, but as I scanned the area with my phone, there was nothing there, just an empty classroom. In that moment, the room felt thick, heavy, with a loaded silence. As quickly as it had stopped, the whispering returned, but this time it was different, older, angrier. "Not Anne." The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the dim light. The voice was coming from the shadows. Anne was the teacher I'd replaced, the one who had retired. I backed away, my hands trembling, the phone light shaking wildly as I tried to find the source. And then I saw it. In the reflection of the window, standing right behind me, was a figure, a small, shadowy silhouette. Its shape was childlike, no older than 10, with hollow, empty eyes. She was reaching for me, but she had no hands. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, but the reflection was still there, arms reaching towards me. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the door. As I reached for the handle, it started slamming shut, but I caught it, throwing it open. The lights in the hallway flickered as I ran out, and I stopped for a second. I heard the voice behind me in the hallway. "Stay." In the pitch black, I felt something cold brush against my arm, like small teeth. I jerked away, but it bit tighter, pulling me back toward the classroom. I stumbled and pulled away. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The lights came back on, the hallway was quiet, and I was alone. The door to the classroom creaked open slowly, and I didn't hesitate. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air. The next day, I handed in my resignation. I never returned to Oak Ridge, and I never spoke about what happened that night. The horse barn at Forbrook Stables had always been a second home to me. As a kid, I spent every summer there, learning how to ride from Mrs. Larkin, the barn's owner and horse riding teacher, who had passed away while I was at college. The barn itself was old, with creaking wooden beams and the comforting scent of hay and leather. It was a place of good memories, at least until this happened. The September after she passed, Mrs. Larkin's nephew, Mark, had an open house at the old barn, a way of introducing himself to the few in our small community who didn't already know him, so he could continue the family riding business. I didn't have any intentions of riding again, but I found myself drawn back, nostalgic for the days I spent around the horses. Also, to support Mark, who had always been kind to me when I was a little girl. The place looked much the same, though there was a certain stillness in the air that hadn't been there before. There were fewer horses now, and I assumed that was the difference. On the day of the open house, the sky was gray, and the chilly wind was scattering the leaves from the trees, making the old people say we were in for a big winter. I talked with Mark for a while before he mentioned that one of the horses, Shadow, had been acting strangely. Shadow had always been a calm and gentle horse, but recently she'd become skittish, refusing to go near the far end of the barn. Curious, I offered to take a look, thinking it might be a simple case of the horse sensing all the recent changes. Mark handed me her reins, and I led Shadow toward the far end of the barn. The moment we approached the darkened stall at the farthest corner, Shadow stopped dead in her track, her ears pinned back, and she snorted nervously. I tugged gently, but she refused to move forward. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth and rotting wood filled my nostrils. It was darker than I remembered, and a chill ran down my spine. "Easy, girl," I murmured, trying to soothe her and myself. The overhead light was out at this end of the barn, and the last stall door was slightly ajar. A strange, muffled sound reached my ears, a quiet, rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking gently from the inside. I waited with Shadow, feeling something tightening in my stomach. The logical part of me said it was probably just the wind, but there was no wind inside the barn. I rationalized that it was probably a rat, hoping to find a reasonable explanation that would ease both my and Shadow's nerves. As I approached the stall, the sound stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I pushed the door open with a creak, peering into the darkness inside. The stall was empty, just a pile of old straw in the corner. But the smell was overpowering, a sickly sweet stench that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of decay and rot. As I stepped inside, I felt my heart rate pick up as I tried to control my breathing. There was something wrong here, something deeply wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, plunging the stall into complete darkness. I heard Shadow skitter and veer away from the stall as I spun around, fumbling for the latch. But my fingers found nothing but cold, slick wood. I pounded on the door, shouting for Mark, but the barn remained deathly silent. Even Shadow was gone. Then the thumping started again, but this time it was louder, closer. It was coming from beneath the straw. I tried backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The straw shook like something was moving beneath it. Slowly it began to shift, revealing a dark shape beneath. My heart raced as I realized what it was. A tightly bound bundle, wrapped in dirty, decaying burlap cloth, bound tightly with frayed rope. The thumping grew louder as it writhed, more frantic, and I could hear it clearly now. It was a heartbeat, slow and heavy, reverberating through the walls. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was stare as the bundle twitched, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. A hand, rotten and bony, emerging from the folds of the cloth. I screamed, staggering back, and hit the stall door with my whole body. It gave way, and I tumbled out into the barn, gasping for air. The light flickered back on, and the barn was silent once more. The only sound the frantic pounding of my own heart. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold wind biting at my skin. I found Mark and I tried to explain what I'd seen. We ran back to the stall together and found it empty, except for clean straw, no smell of decay, and no tied bundle. The barn was lit and calm, with even Shadow chewing quietly in her stall. None of it made sense, and I never returned to Forbrook Stables after that night. Whatever I had seen buried there beneath the straw in that stall, whatever I disturbed that night, had definitely been there. Whatever had been buried, hidden away, wanted to be seen that night. I just wish I hadn't been the one to see it. If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.